Hello and welcome to Botany for the Foraging Herbalist. This video will help you properly identify plants. And to do that, you're going to need a smattering of botanical knowledge. And I hope that this video supplies that knowledge so that you can gather herbs safely and accurately. There's a lot involved in gathering these herbs so that you make sure you have the right information. So let's begin. Let's begin by talking about dichotomous keys. There are several, two of which I think are the best is how to know the spring flowers and how to know the fall flowers. I believe they're both available on Amazon. These keys are a series of two questions. Each time you answer a question, it leads you to two more questions. And eventually, if you follow this path through sometimes many questions, you identify accurately the plant you're looking at, you're holding in your hand, or you're looking at growing out of the ground. And that's very important for safety reasons. If you're going to gather a plant that you're going to ingest for food or for medicinal purposes, or if you're going to recommend somebody else do it, you want to make sure that what you gather is exactly what you think it is. So what we want to do today is look at some botanical terms so that you'll be able to successfully use a dichotomous key. Let's start by talking about types of plants. And I put types in quotations here because we're not going to talk about taxonomic classifications like kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. What we're going to talk about is two major groups of plants. The first one is called the gymnosperms. That comes from two Greek words meaning literally naked or bare, uncovered seed. And these are plants that produce seeds but not in a fruit. The example would be mosses, ferns, and the evergreens such as pines, cedars, firs, any of the evergreen trees that we have growing in our woods and yards. The second group is called the angiosperms. The word angio is a Greek term meaning vessel, but it also can mean hidden within the vessel. And of course, sperm means seed. And these are plants that actually hide their seed in an ovary. And this ovary, when ripened, is commonly called a fruit. Now let's subdivide that like a dichotomous key one more time and talk about the two types of angiosperms. Most of the plants you'll gather will be angiosperms. And so you need to be really familiar with these two types of angiosperms. The first one is called the monocotyledon. Now that's a big word, but let me explain what that means. Mono, of course, means one. And cotyledon means seed leaf. And that's the embryo leaf. If you were to plant a kernel of corn or put it in a wet paper towel and it sprouts, that will produce a leaf, but it will produce a single mono leaf, embryonic leaf, and that embryonic leaf is called a cotyledon. Corn, grasses, anything whose leaves are have parallel veins is a monocotyledon. The other type of angiosperm is called the dicotyledon. You know what that means. Di means two, cotyledon, seed leaves, these seed leaves. And these are plants who has two embryonic leaves. Classic example is the bean. Again, you sprout a bean seed, and that bean will put forth two little embryo leaves. Its first leaves will be in two. Most of the trees, most herbs, most larger plants are dicots. By the way, also, the monocot flowers are in threes or multiples of threes, and the dicot flowers are in fours or fives and also multiples of fours or fives. Again, it would be my suggestion as you watch this video to go back and pause it and literally pay close attention to each of these slides and these differences we're making in these two types of plants. So we have monocots and dicots, which are the two types of angiosperms. Let's look a little deeper into monocots and dicots. If you look at the cross section of a stem of grass, and you look at what's called the vascular bundles, that is the bundles of veins in this stem. you'll see that the vascular bundles are just randomly scattered throughout that cross section. But if you look at dicots under a microscope, a cross section of a dicot stem, say a buttercup or just any soft tissued plant, you're going to see that the vascular bundles are in a ring. And then as you look at trees, and you've seen this, the trees grow their tissue in these yearly rings, and each spring new tissue grows, and that's why the rings are called annual rings. They develop each year. Now, what are vascular bundles? What are vascular tissue? Let's look at that a little deeper, another deep dive into botany. And again, this may be more information than you need, but it's important information to understand how plants work. There are two types of vascular tissue in plants. The first one is called xylem. Xylem begins in the roots and carries water up from the roots to the rest of the plant. When you water a plant in the dirt, you say, well, how does that water get up to the leaves and the flowers? It does that by going through the xylem, which is just like the veins in your body, but it carries water and nutrients from the roots. The other vascular tissue is called phloem, and phloem carries food, in particular sap and sugar made in the leaves during photosynthesis. It carries that down to the rest of the plant. Basically, it's the kitchen. The leaf is the kitchen of the plant, where it makes these sugar compounds and then feeds the rest of the plant. By the way, the woody part of a tree, the part that's hard you build a house out of, is really just old, dried out xylem tissue. Well, there are basically, now let's get into actual parts of the plants. There are basically 6 parts of plants. The first 3 are called vegetative structures, and they are roots, stems, and leaves. And the next 3 are what we call reproductive structures, and that's flowers, fruits, and seeds. And so let's break this down, because again, if you're using a key, and I hope you really, really use some kind of a dichotomous key to identify your plants. Otherwise, you're just looking at pictures and hoping what you are looking at in the field is what you see in the picture of the field book. But a key leaves nothing to chance. So let's look a little deeper. The stems we're not going to talk much about, except just know that not all stems are round. The wild mint that you find in the field and the roadsides has a very square stem. But stems are what they are, but the real identifying parts of plants are the leaves and the flowers. So let's take a little closer look at leaves. There are basically 3 types of leaves. The first one's a simple leaf, and it's exactly what the word says. It's just a single blade with a stem called a petiole, and then the venation, the veins within the leaf, that gather the sugar made by that leaf and then carry it through the phloem to the rest of the plant. The second type of leaf is a compound leaf, and like I have in the image in the video is a sumac, and it's one leaf. That is not just many leaves, it's actually just one leaf with small leaflets. And when you look at a compound leaf like that, it's called pinnately compound. Then you have something called palmate compound leaves, such as the Ohio buckeye, where the leaves are kind of much like the shape of a palm tree. This can be confusing, however. The 4-leaf clover is not a 4-leaf clover at all. A 3-leaf clover is not a 3-leaf clover. It's actually a single leaf with 3 leaflets. And also, an identifying mark of plants is the arrangement of the leaves, that is, how the leaves are arranged. If the leaves are arranged opposite of one another, that's called, imagine that, opposite arrangement. And if they are alternate, well, that's called alternate arrangement. And again, dichotomous keys will reference these kinds of things. Does this plant have alternate leaves, or does it have opposite leaves? And then you'll answer that question and move on to the next question in a key. Let's continue to look at leaves. Leaf shapes are also very important when you identify a plant. The edges of the leaves, what do the edges look like? Is it entire? And that simply means smooth around the edge. Or serrate, meaning like a saw. There's also dentate and lobed, and also something called cleft, which is supposed to be a maple tree, but my art didn't do quite as well as it should have. There are many, many more of these leaf edges that, again, some of these will be included in the introductory pages of some of these books. The actual shape of the leaf also varies a lot too. You have things like lanceolate, which is like a lance or like a spear, oblong, elliptical, cordate, meaning heart-shaped, and many, many more. But then also look at the venation. Parallel vein leaves are generally characteristics of monocots. Won't say 100% because sometimes the dicots will pretend that they have parallel veins, but most of the parallel veins are the monocots. Then you have what is called pinnate. That means radiating from a central vascular bundle. And then palmate, like a maple tree or a sycamore tree leaf, where these veins come out from a central hub. So that's the different types of leaves. And that pretty much ends the vegetative sections. That's really all we wanted to talk about. We can spend a long time talking about roots. There are different kinds of roots. There are aerial roots, there are subterranean roots, and make sure, because some things we think are roots aren't. For instance, a sweet potato is a root, but an Irish potato is an underground stem. So it can get very confusing. But let's move on to the reproductive parts of a plant, and that's the flowers, the fruits, and the seeds. And if you're identifying plants in the spring or the fall, the flowers are going to be the obviously prominent structure on that plant. They'll be the ones that will catch your eye first. And there are two types of flowers. There are complete flowers, which have all 4 flower parts that we're going to talk about in just a second. And there are perfect flowers, which have both pistils and stamens, or male and female parts. Now, obviously, if they're complete plants, they're incomplete plants. Many trees don't have petals. You don't look at a tree and say, look at those beautiful flowers. But all trees have flowers. They just don't have beautiful petals. They have the male and female structures. So that would be an incomplete flower. And then there are some plants like the holly tree and the carrot, wild carrot, that are imperfect. That is, they have male and female plants that are separate. And one will only have the male structures and one will have the female structures. But let's look at these 4 parts of a flower. The first is the sepal. And the sepals, when you look at a bud and a bud is green, that's the sepals encasing that flower. And as the flower is ready to blossom, those sepals break apart and curl under. And then the petals, the second part, the brightly colored, mainly to attract insects, the petals become very obvious. But then in the middle of that flower will be the real 2 business ends of a flower. And that's the male stamens and the female pistils. These are the reproductive organs of a plant. The pistil has 3 parts. The top is called a stigma, and it's where the pollen actually lands on that plant. And if the pollen lands there, and then the plant will be pollinated. And then as the pollen moves down and deposits its sperm in the ovary, then it becomes fertilized. So there's pollination, that is the transfer of pollen from a stamen to a stigma, and then there's fertilization. And so the 3 parts of the pistil is the stigma, the style, which is a long tube. And by the way, just for interest, when you silk an ear of corn, when you take the silk off of the ear of corn, that silk is actually very long styles of each individual corn seed. If you followed that, which it might be very difficult to do, but if you followed that corn silk take one strand of corn silk and followed it all the way, it would go right to the base of a kernel of corn and enter that kernel of corn, where the pollen lands on that silk and travels down inside that style to the ovary to fertilize the ovules, the seeds. And so that's the female structure. The male structure is called the stamen, and it has two parts: the filament, which is actually the stalk, and then the anther. And the anther is what produces the pollen. If you have allergies, blame it all on the anther. They are the pollen producing structures of a male reproductive organ of a plant. And again, if you're looking at a dichotomous key, it'll tell you what the anther may look like. It may tell you how long an average style is on a pistil. So it's always good to have a magnifying glass and a ruler that measures in millimeters if you're out identifying plants. And again, I want to encourage you. Some you'll learn so well you'll be able to know the plant and just pick it up when you see it. But some, when you go out and look for it, it'll be the first time you've ever found it, and you really want to make sure you know exactly what you're looking at. And the final two reproductive parts of a plant are hard to separate, and that's the fruit and the seed. A fruit is simply a ripened ovary. When that bean or pea or watermelon or whatever it is, when that flower becomes pollinated and then fertilized, that fruit begins to develop, and it's basically a protective structure to both protect and feed that embryonic plant. You wonder why a watermelon's so sweet? It's not so you can have a good summer. It's because the seeds of the watermelon feed on that sugar until time for them to sprout. And so you have basically three parts of a fruit. And I think of a peach or a pear. And you have the exocarp, which is the skin or peel. You have the mesocarp, or what we call the flesh. If you're eating an apple, you're eating mostly, if you peel it, you're eating the mesocarp. And then the endocarp, which is the core, or in the case of a peach, the stone. And within that endocarp, that protective layer, you'll find the ovary with the ovules or seed. And there are several types of fruit. Berries. And all a berry means is that the seeds are scattered throughout the plant. So, believe it or not, a watermelon is a berry, a tomato is a berry. These seeds are scattered throughout. A pome has a seed, and it has multiple seeds, and those seeds are in a core. Think apple and pear. A drupe has a single seed in the middle, like a cherry or peach, and a king has multiple ovaries. A strawberry is not one single fruit, but it's several fruits compacted together, as is a pineapple. A nut, pretty obvious, the seed is protected by a hard shell like an acorn. A samara, and that's a fruit with a wing like maple seeds or ash seeds. And then legumes, and these seeds, it has its seeds in a linear pod like beans and peas. Well, we could go on, and again, I probably need to do a couple of other videos on where to find these plants, but I hope this has helped you, and I hope that you will watch this several times, take pictures of the screen. I don't know how you would do that, save screenshots so that you can see these leaves and buy a dichotomous key. Thank you so much, and thank you a lot for watching, and have a great day. Hi, I wanted to do a quick addendum to my video on botany for the foraging herbalist and just talk about a couple of things that the context of the video I did didn't afford. First of all, there are 4 books I think everybody ought to have if they're going to get into this idea of foraging for food and medicinal plants. One is Foraging for the Beginner. Great book. It's by Diamond Press. I don't even know who the author is. I'm sure it's got several authors. But it is a great book. It's really 2 books in one. One talks about the types of plants you're looking for, and the other one actually has recipes and remedies. So it's really, like I say, 2 books in one. The second one, Stalking the Wild Asparagus, which sounds funny, and it is, by Yule Gibbons. And Yule Gibbons was a popular guy back in the 70s, but he kind of began the foraging movement, both for food and for medicinal plants. Then 2 books that are as I said in the previous video, they are the dichotomous keys that will really help you identify plants very specifically. And one is How to Know the Spring Flowers and How to Know the Fall Flowers. These two books will allow you to not make mistakes. And again, if you're going to ingest, or especially, well, not especially, but if you're going to ingest and you're going to suggest that other people ingest a wild plant for food or medicine, you really, really, really have to be 100% sure of what you're gathering. I used to have a professor that taught me mycology, the study of mushrooms. And he said there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. By that he meant that if you're just bold enough to go out and pick whatever you see, you're going to pick the wrong thing. So make sure that you know exactly what you're gathering. So safety is on the one hand, but then also enjoyment is on the other. Don't be so focused on gathering plants that you forget that where you're gathering is probably a really beautiful place. And so I'm thinking my next video may be on the ecology of foraging, because there are areas that are far more favorable for foraging than others. Some people say, let's go out in the woods and find wild plants to eat. Well, guess what? The woods don't have many wild plants to eat. Fields, farms, they don't have many wild plants to eat, and they've been sprayed over. The real place where you're going to find these plants are what's called the edge, the place where woods and field come together. It'll be the place where all the briars and brambles and hard to get to spot, but it will have the wild plants you're looking for. This probably won't be my last video. I've kind of enjoyed doing this, but it's certainly my first, so I apologize for any mistakes or glitches in it, but I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching. You guys have a great day.